Here's how I'd like to begin, with a quotation in a book that I read called The Balkan Trail. Frederick Moore was an American journalist who traveled in Macedonia and Albania in 1906. In fact, no, the book was published in 1906. He made his trip in 1903, but he says, Albania is the most romantic country in Europe, probably in all the world. It is a lawless land where might makes right. The homes of men are strongholds built of stone with no windows on the ground floors and those above mere loopholes. At the corners of the village or estate are couleurs or towers of defense from which the enemy can be seen far down the road. The first law of the land is the law of the gun, as it was in the Wild West, and men have banded together in clans for offensive and defensive purposes. There's no education in Albania. The Turks have kept the country illiterate, and promises have come to be bonds. It is because the Albanians keep their word that Sultan Abdul Hamid has chosen them as his bodyguards. But the Albanian has no regard for the man he's not sworn to. Okay, this is an impression formed by a traveling journalist, and obviously it's just his opinion, his impression, and this applies to the countryside. There were, of course, towns and cities in Albania which were a bit more civilized. Here's a map. This is actually an Albanian map with the town names all in Albanian form. The map is from the 1920s. You notice that to the east here, it says Yugoslavia. So this, it's Serbia now, but at that point it was Yugoslavia. There's a dotted line right here, which is the boundary between Yugoslavia and Greece. And this part is Macedonia, the territory I've been talking about in recent presentations. Here's Monastir and Skopje, called Shkup by the Albanians. Here you can see the major towns, and these names are going to recur on postmarks on the various stamps I'm going to show. Shkodra, also called Scutari by the Italians and the Austrians. Dureshi, Tirana, Elbasani, Barati, Vlora, and Ginocastra, also known as Argyrocastra by the Greeks. And here's Korcha or Koritsa to the Greeks. Most of the mail went to and from these towns, or from a town in Albania to a foreign destination. There was practically no sending of mail or any postal activity in the rural areas. This book by John Phipps is a tremendous resource. It's an excellent book on this whole area, which first goes into the history and then the posts of different parts of Albania at different points. It's a very complicated history. When Albania was first created, it was not a unified country at all, but different forces controlled different parts. And then almost immediately after that, well, within a couple of years, World War I came along and threw everything into disorder once again. But this book is essential to sorting it all out. So I begin with precursors. These are Turkish stamps, which were used postmarked in Albanian towns. This one, Avlona, that's the Turkish form of the one town called Vlore by the Albanians. This is Elbasan, another town. And here's Koritsa. The name is spelled many different ways. It was spelled many ways by the Turks themselves and then differently by the Greeks and the Albanians. In addition to the Turkish stamps, we have stamps issued by the European countries that operated post offices in the Ottoman Empire. And some of them were canceled in Albania. These stamps were in use throughout the Ottoman Empire. So the only way that you can identify them as stamps of Albania is by the postmarks. And here on the right, of course, we have Valona. That's the Italian form for Vlore. And this one, you can't see much of the first word, but it's Scutari in Albanian, in German. The reason say Scutari in Albanian is that there's another Scutari. There's a town with that name that is part of Turkey. I believe it's on the Black Sea coast. And that's also part of the Ottoman Empire. So very likely these same stamps were used there and canceled differently. The Italians operated a rather extensive postal service in Albanian territory and issued many, many stamps. These are regular Italian stamps overprinted for use in Albania. Only a few of them are canceled, and here's one that's canceled in Durazzo, what the Albanians call Dureshi, and this Scutari. So there are quite a few sets of these. They're the stamps issued for use in all of Albanian territory, and then there are special issues for different towns. This is the set issued for Durazzo. These are for Scutari, the one the Albanians call Shkodër or Shkodra. The cancellations in these cases, I believe, are all postmarks of the towns for which these stamps were issued. And here's the set issued for Bologna. Okay, so that's those are the precursors. In the fall of 1912, things started to change. And by the way, I should mention that when I talk about things taking place in Albania before it became an independent country, we're talking about a geographical territory, which is fairly well defined. We could go back to that map, but the point I would make is just that there's a traditional line of boundary between Montenegro to the north, and also between Albania and Macedonia to the east. There are mountains and lakes that have traditionally been held to mark the boundaries between those territories. However, the southern boundary was considerably more difficult to establish. When you get to the southern part of Albania, there's a large population of Greeks who basically consider it to be Greek territory. And that was the cause of a lot of confusion and conflict, and of course, also interesting postal consequences. But we start with the Balkan War, began on October 8th, 1912. By agreement between the Allies, Montenegro was the first country to declare war on the Turks, and was quickly followed by its allies, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece. These countries had a lot of conflicts between themselves, but they all got together and united in driving the Turks out of most of their European territory. And it happened very quickly, within a few weeks. Now, the Albanians themselves were not involved. They were not part of this alliance, but decided on a policy of neutrality, because they were afraid that the other Balkan states merely wanted to take the place of the Ottomans and carve up their territory and take it over and divide it among themselves. So they didn't want to get involved in the conflict or to take sides with anybody. A preliminary peace agreement was signed on December 3. So you see, from October 8 to December 3, the whole thing was largely over. Not entirely, but there was a preliminary treaty, although the Turks still controlled a few cities which were under siege. At that point, Serbian forces controlled most of central and northern Albania, and the Greeks held the southern area, also known as North Epirus, which had a mixed population of Albanians and Greeks. Meanwhile, on November 28, 1912, a group of Albanian nationalists led by Ismail Kemal met at Vlore and declared independence. Now, they controlled almost no territory at that point. They didn't have an army of their own in control of any territory, but they did have they were in charge in Vlore. They formed a government which began to issue stamps. First, the stamp issues of the Greek occupation. The Greeks overprinted their own stamps with this overprint that means Greek administration. And these were for use in all of the territories that were taken over from the Ottomans, not just Epirus, but the islands and other territories in Greece. And so the only way you can identify it as having been used in Albanian territory, or what later became Albania, is by the postmark. And this is Argyrochastron. This is the second issue. After the overprints, they actually created some stamps which were specifically for use in the new territories acquired from the Ottoman Empire. And these three were canceled in towns that later became part of Albania: Argyrochastron, Tepelenion, and Hagioi Saranta. This is an interesting name, by the way, that Hagioi Saranta means 40 saints. In Italian, it's Santi Quaranta. The Albanians called it Sarande.
Is this war, the 1912 war, is that the first?
That is, yes, the beginning of what is called the First Balkan War. I'll get to, the later history. The Second Balkan War came along in the middle of 1913, but we're not there yet. Okay, so these stamps were never issued. They were, shall we say, a speculative issue. Some Albanians, probably Albanian emigres, went to Trieste and had a company called the Modiano Company print these stamps. They were hoping that they could then persuade the authorities in Vlore, who'd set up their government, to use these stamps. But the stamps were rejected. And there's several reasons. I wonder if anyone can guess what the reasons might be why the Albanians in Vlore didn't want to use these stamps. One part of it has to do with the inscriptions. Only the top one is in Albanian. Posta Eshgerips, sorry, I'm not used to pronouncing this. Eshgeripese. But the rest, Independance Albanaise, that's a French version.
French, yeah.
Yeah, and Postus, of course, is the French at the bottom. So 2 out of the 3 inscriptions are in French. The other problem is the eagle has only one head, and the traditional Albanian symbol was a double-headed eagle.
Were they using francs and cents, or is that something else problem?
The Albanians at the time mostly used Turkish currency, para and piasters, but there was an effort on to establish a new currency. And there were other early Albanian stamps that were denominated in cents and francs, and then later overprinted with the Turkish currency, para, and it's called grosh, but it's the same as piastra, because the Albanians were simply not accepting the cents and francs until much later. All right, the first stamp of Albania listed by the Michel catalog, Michel 1, is this imprint at the left. It's a stamp, hand stamped by the Ministry of Posts, Telegraph and Telephone in May of 1913. It's not listed or mentioned by Scott, and I'm not sure of the reason for that. You might think that it was because it's not a loose stamp, but rather a piece of postal stationery. And that's true in this case. It's stamped directly on an envelope, but these are also known in the form of stamps that have been cut out and pasted down on an envelope, which is also true of some of the later hand stamp issues that Scott does list. So why Scott chooses not to list this one, I don't know.
Speculation I can make, Alan, is that it's because it's telegraph. That's the naughty word as far as Scott is concerned.
Well, yes, but you notice first it says post. Maybe they consider that any contamination with telegraphic use is disqualifying.
Telegraphic cancels were very often violet, like this is, rather than black.
Yes, but a lot of the cancellations of the early Albanian stamps are purple. I don't know the reason for that, but maybe purple ink just happened to be available.
So that for sure is not a telegraph.
No, it's not a telegraph, although it's issued by the ministry. The same ministry controlled the postal service, the telegraphic service, and the telephones.
Right. That's very common at that time.
And you notice that in the center here is a little shield with the double-headed eagle on it. That again and again as we go on to the early Albanian stamps. This is the second issue of early June of 1913. And this one is listed by Scott, but they put it later, they have it as number 20. Altogether, I find many things to criticize in Scott's listings based on the information in the book that I mentioned. Scott simply is not very accurate if my book is to be believed. And it's a very thoroughly researched book, so I would tend to trust it first before the catalog. You notice this, it's an unaddressed piece of postal stationery or cover signed by two notable experts. This is Sergio Sismondo and this is Peter Holcomb. They're well-known signatures. I suppose you would have to say that these are favor cancels. It doesn't appear that this piece of mail ever went through the post. It was just the stamp canceled as a favor in Elbasan and Kukes. To the double eagle. Now these stamps are actually ones that first attracted me to the early issues of Albania. I just looked at these and, you know, they're not even shown in the Scott International album that I had as a kid, but I saw them in the catalog and that overprint just looked so cool that I aspired to someday own them. And so now I do have some. The one on the left is listed as Scott number 1. Even though this is the 2.5 piastra stamp, Turkish stamp of 1908, it was the first one apparently that was actually overprinted, and so they listed as Scott 1. And then here we have 5 paras and 10 paras with the double eagle overprint. The overprints were applied by hand. They had a hand stamping device, and clearly they took some trouble to make it neat. There are many varieties of these. Later on, I'll show you some of the varieties. Some of them were inverted, and I've even seen them overprinted sideways, which is clearly just an effort to create a curiosity, or in other colors other than black. Although the black ones are the only ones that were supposedly available to the public for postal use. Here are another 3 stamps on peace, the 20 para, 1 piastra, 2 piastra, and 5 piastra. I might say that the values given for these in the Scott catalog are rather exaggerated. They have some of these at over $1,000, and they're available in auctions for a lot less than that. You know, it's a question of how many people are bidding and where the auction company chooses to place the starting bids. But I can assure you that the Scott catalog values are really kind of extreme. Cancellations in Flore, which is the center where the government first established itself. Later, they controlled Durrës, which is another, these are both coastal cities on the Adriatic coast. And Shkodër is another one, the northernmost of the cities. And this one looks like Elbasan, which is in the interior. By that time, the government in Flore did control more territory, although there were still some areas that were holding out, as we'll find out later. Here are 2 stamps, Turkish stamps with this mark on them. This is the letter B in Turkish, which stands for discount. My understanding about these is that in order to encourage people to use the Turkish stamps rather than any of the foreign post offices, the Ottoman authorities overprinted some with this discount mark and sold them for less than the face value, just as an incentive. Now that's the story as I have heard it.
In early Spain, they did the same thing to encourage the use of stamps.
Yeah.
As opposed to handwritten, paying cash over the counter with it was cheaper to use the stamps for the first 3 or 4 years.
Here are some varieties, an inverted overprint and an overprint in red. These were done just, the postal authorities who were doing the overprinting gave these away as favors to government officials. And one way or another, they eventually ended up in the philatelic marketplace. And finally, the overprint on a newspaper stamp. Okay, that's part one of Stamps of Albania.